our website either by tomorrow or early next week. So if you need to refer to the presentation, or if you'd like to refer other folks that weren't able to make it, we should have that up on the Erie Canal Way website, let's say by the latest early next week. All right. So here's a look at the agenda. I'm going to share some background on this study and why it was needed. Leanne will take us through the study, and Sasha will share information about recently released guiding documents from Canal Corporation. And then we'll conclude with funding opportunities and then a Q&A session. So we'll move on to the next slide, and I'll just give a background as to why we decided to do this study. As you know, we've all noticed a lot more people using the Erie Canal Way Trail and the Water Trail, especially since the completion of the Empire State Trail, and plus the development of the Water Trail programs like Canal Way Challenge on the canals, and with the Events and Tourism Infrastructure Grants program. We are definitely seeing more cyclists, more paddlers, more walkers, more use on the trail. And individually, communities are drawing people for canal-themed events, and those events seem to be growing as well. As we all know, we're celebrating the bicentennial of the Erie Canal, and this study is very much a forward-looking document to help bring us into the next century. With multiple user types of the Erie Canal, Canalway Trail, and the Water Trail, the system has posed a challenge for creating a consistent and predictable experience for all visitors. And this study really considers how to address these challenges for the next century, and it's a tool for project planning for making improvements along the canal system and for its users. So our next slide shares a vision statement that is a joint statement that Erie Canalway and Canal Corporation have put together. I won't read the whole thing to you, but essentially what we're looking to do is create a world-class destination for recreation, gain recognition as one of the most accessible trails in the nation. We'd like to evolve from a linear recreation way to a complete network of waterways, parks, and trails. And then finally, as I mentioned before, create a consistent and predictable experience on the trail. So with that, I will pass this along to Sasha, who's going to be sharing some more information about new guiding documents.
Great. So as Mona mentioned, this is a very important year for the Erie Canalway, our bicentennial year. And in preparation for this year, the Canal Corporation and other stakeholders have been doing a lot of thought about what the canal system will look like over the next century. And one of those efforts was undertaken by the Canal Recreation Way Commission. Over the last almost 2 years, they've been working with stakeholders and identifying a plan for the canal system for the next 25 years. And in May, they released the 2050 plan. And like I mentioned, it lays out a vision and framework for the next 25 years for improving access, amenities, and experiences along the New York State canal system, as well as identifying avenues for strategic land use, environmental stewardship, and improved accessibility. The plan seeks to establish the canal system as a sustainable, well-maintained, and connective park system. And this plan isn't just for Canal Corporation use or other state agencies. It's really intended too for canal corridor communities, elected officials, business owners, and advocates alike. While the commission was contemplating this vision, the New York State Canal Corporation was also thinking about how we can make our system feel more like a park-like environment with consistency across the board. That is something we heard from stakeholders over and over again, that they want to feel like they're at a park. They want consistency during their visitation. So our internal efforts align really nicely with the 2050 plan, because we had also been working on what our public facing property will look like into the future. And so we can go to the next slide. And so part of one of the efforts we've been working on over the last year is updating our branding guidelines as well as our signage design guidelines. So on the left-hand side of your screen, you'll see our new branding identifiers. The top one on the left is our canal site identifiers. You'll see this at our lock houses, on our work equipment, on our t-shirts. This is the new look for the canal system, for the waterway in particular. This is intended for Canal Corporation property only and for our use. However, if you are a municipality or county that has signage that directs someone to a lock, you certainly are welcome to use this logo. The one below it is the Canalway Trail identifier. These are the blazes that you see out on the trail system. This identifier will be used on the trail across the board, regardless of site ownership. And we have a link to this design file on our website, so anyone is able to access it. And then you'll see on, I guess, the center and right-hand side of your screen, the new signage design guidelines. So they're intended for wayfinding and interpretive signs. Our guidelines include font, coloration, materials, and installation types. So we hope to make it as easy as possible for those who are installing any signage on our property to do it. I want to be clear that this new signage design guideline is intended for Canal Corporation property or canal permitted property only. So municipalities and counties with their own ownership do not need to comply with our standards. However, they can certainly use it as a template or consider materials that we're using. And then lastly, regarding standards and designs, we can move on to the next slide. The Canal Corporation has adopted a new set of standards for amenity types on Canal Corporation property. So we're calling this the kit of parts. It includes specifications for benches, tables, lighting, fix-it stations, drinking fountains, garbage receptacles, play structures, and more. The package of standards include approved vendors, installation details, and accessibility considerations. And so the thought was that we wanted sustainable materials that would be easy to maintain, and also affordable materials. And this is for Canal Corporation property, but once again, if you are a community looking to do some type of amenity improvement, you certainly could use this as inspiration. The thought is that we have hundreds of different types of amenities out on the system and signs, and the look of the signs changes wherever across the system. So we see different colors, different fonts. We wanted to provide a more uniform look for our property in the same way that you would experience it at a state park or DEC facility. So this initiative really lent itself very well to the work that we've been doing with Colliers, because we're talking about amenities, we're talking about signage, but we didn't quite know what was out on the system. So understanding the condition of existing amenities, and then also the need where there's a need for additional amenities, is a very helpful exercise as we look to roll out these new standards. One quick note is that we are not doing a wholesale replacement of our amenities and our signage. We'll do them on a rolling basis as we need to fix and maintain and do capital improvements. So thank you, and I'll pass it over to Leanne to actually get into the meat of today's call.
Thanks, Sasha. So yeah, I think Sasha and Mona both did a great job of sort of setting the stage for, why a study like this is so important and why it right now is particularly timely and aligns really well with other initiatives that are going on, both at Erie Canalway and at Canal Corporation. So I will go through the details of the study and our methodology and findings, but before I do that, I just want to kind of set the stage, because we've gotten a lot of questions about, what is this study really for? Who is it intended for? How will it be used? And so I want to just kind of start by saying, this was, a study that was obviously commissioned by Erie Canalway and Canal Corporation. I think they'll be the primary users of the findings and recommendations, and it'll be a great resource for them to use when they are planning for capital investments, when they are, reviewing grant applications and trying to decide what the highest priorities might be with limited funding. It'll be a great way to track progress over time and see how amenity condition, amenity variety, and consistency improves over time. But with that said, I think it also serves as a fantastic resource for any entity who is involved with or interested in improving the recreational experience on the canal. So that includes communities who have property or maintain Canal Corporation property along the canal, interest groups, nonprofits, even private vendors who might be interested in providing bike rentals or paddlecraft rentals along the way, potentially private campsites or anything like that. This also gives you a really great snapshot, place by place, of what's available now and what these entities see as priorities for investment. I will note what this is not a, it is available to the public, but it's not meant to be used as, a user guide or a tourism guide for planning your trip or anything like this. It's really more of a planning document and a reference for future capital investment. In terms of our methodology, we set out to achieve sort of the 4 project goals that are listed at the top here, starting with, very simply, what amenities are out there right now, what exists, where is it, what is its condition, what is its type. We also identified gaps between amenities, so identified places where there might be too far to travel between 2 restrooms, 2 hand launches, 2 picnic areas. Where were those gaps where it's too far, and then how would we fill those gaps? Mostly through stakeholder interviews, we identified what users of the trail see now as opportunities, constraints, good things, bad things about their experience there, and what they'd like to see improved in the future. And then we used all of that together to identify opportunities to enhance amenities, whether it was in a specific location or on a more global scale, thinking about the trail system as a whole. So all 4 of those project goals feed really well into sort of the broader strategic goals that are encapsulated in the vision statement that Mona shared at the beginning, which are primarily improve the recreational experience, make this a more comfortable, welcoming, exciting environment for people to recreate on a broader scale. So attracting more than just your hardiest recreationalists to the trail and kind of broadening the use. Also, kind of in line with that, improving amenities for people of all abilities, and that could relate to people with mobility impairments, people who need adaptive equipment, but it could also relate to people who are just new users and not super experienced in bicycling, paddling, running, walking for recreation, and are interested in trying this out for the first time and removing barriers for people like that as well. In so doing, we hope that by increasing the number of people who use the trail and its sort of broad awareness across the state, that can lend itself to enhancing long-term stewardship of the trail by both, land trail users and water trail users. So this was a very broad and deep study, kind of when you think about the broad research question of, how do we assess these amenities? We used a lot of different sources of information to start to pick away at that. I mentioned already we relied a lot on stakeholder input through a series of focus groups that I'll talk about more in a moment, to understand what people who are on the ground are seeing and what they see as opportunities or needs. We relied on several guiding documents. Erie Canalway has a fantastic water trail guidebook that was a great resource just in identifying locations. The hand launch facility design guide, several other online resources and maps that are available through PTNY and others to sort of navigate the trail. The largest input was certainly our field data collection. So going out and traveling the entirety of both of the trails to actually collect and geo-reference the locations of every single amenity related to recreation along the trail. And then also this was informed by best practices research. So that could be related to accessibility requirements, but also just looking at other trails, in the region that have success and what do we see as, things that we might want to adopt here. So all of those inputs fed into our analysis, which was primarily done through GIS, and then also using some quantitative analysis in Excel to understand the overall condition of amenities on the trail, the spacing of amenities, the types that are available, and then what potential barriers to accessibility we observed. Based on our analysis, we were able to identify guidelines for amenity spacing, best practices to enhance accessibility across the trail. We identified locations along the trail that could be considered hubs or nodes of amenities based on several criteria that I'll go through in a moment. And then both at specific geographies and across the trail, what are the needs and opportunities to improve? I think it was in spring of 2024 that we really embarked on this stakeholder interview process in earnest. Mona did a fantastic job of reaching out to many different user types, user groups, interest groups of all forms, all across the state. So I think we really did a fantastic job of covering, every corner of the trail and every potential type of user. You can see the full list of who was engaged here. We probably had, several bicycling groups, one to the west, one to the east, same thing for rowing and paddling. And then we also met on the left-hand side with several agencies that are involved in the trail. Each of these groups certainly had, their own priorities, whether it was based on their location or their specific mode of travel or specific interest. But what we did hear consistently across the board through every single stakeholder group or focus group was the need for enhanced consistency and predictability along the trail. So when we're talking about consistency, we're talking about making sure that anywhere you go along the trail, there is, the same type of amenity, the same grouping of amenities, and the same condition of amenities, as well as sort of the trail itself being, in a consistent condition across the state. Predictability refers to, having a reasonable expectation that every so often you're going to have access to a restroom or have access to a place to get off of the water and rest. And I think hand in hand with predictability is the importance of wayfinding. Not only, is that stuff located in a predictable location and consistently spaced, but also do I have access to the information that I need to make sure that I can find those things and that they're obvious to me. Something that I thought was really poignant that came across in one of our stakeholder interviews was that even though most people these days have smartphones and can navigate the trail using Google Maps or some other navigation device, it would be such a fantastic experience to be able to navigate the entire trail without ever having to pull it out of your pocket. And I think that really spoke to me, just thinking about, that's actually kind of daunting, I think, to anyone at this point in their lives with the prevalence of smartphones and GPS-enabled devices. But I think that's a really great ideal to strive for in the long term. And then lastly, I just want to point out among all of these user groups, whether they're bicyclists, paddlers, boaters, every single user group said these are the 3 amenities that are most critical to us having a positive experience on the trail, which is consistent access to restrooms, drinking water, and wayfinding signage. Following our stakeholder interviews, which certainly informed our data collection process, we set out to actually collect data along the trail. And so, as I said, we collected the entire Erie Canal and Canalway Trail from the Tonawandas to Waterford. In the case of the land trail, we biked the entire thing in segments and used our mobile devices and a surveying app to basically collect every single amenity, give it a point on a map, and then collect a lot of information about that amenity. For the water trail, we didn't paddle the entire thing, but we did use the water trail guidebook to identify any trail access points along it, and then drove to those locations, inventoried those amenities sort of along the way. For the ease of sort of breaking down our analysis into manageable chunks, we divided the trail system into 4 regions, which you can see on your screen. This is the last of our 4 workshops. We did one for each region, and today we're focusing on region 4, which starts in Tonawanda and ends in Fairport. And then I also want to take a moment just to give a little more explanation of how we actually chose, which amenities we would collect. We've had a lot of questions about this that have come up, both during the study and after, and how we actually were able to draw that line in terms of what is associated with the trail. someone could make the argument that anything within, a 5-mile radius of the trail is considered an amenity that someone might use. But we really, for the sake of, our scope and making this a manageable study, we focused on things that were either immediately visible from the trail and also, reasonably understood to be associated with recreational trail use. So I have a couple of examples just to illustrate that point. The first is this one here, Amherst Veterans Canal Park, which I believe is in this region. This is a sort of a smaller scale community park. Both the Erie Canalway Trail and the Erie Canal run right alongside it or right through it. All of the amenities here are, right up next to both of the trails and related to trail use. So parking, restrooms, a boat launch, a hand launch. All of these things are directly related to recreation and would be reasonably used by someone who might be coming here to access the trail. So in this case, we would have collected all amenities in this location. Conversely, this is Parrington Park just outside of Fairport. This is a much larger scale park that does, draw a lot of recreational users for the trail, but also is drawing people from the community who are just here for recreation generally. So in this case, we would have kind of divided it up between sort of a collection zone and a non-collection zone. And so the things in that green circle are, things that are immediately located along the trail and are related to trail use. Basketball courts, tennis courts, playgrounds, auxiliary parking would not have been collected as part of this study. And then I also want to mention that when it came to privately owned marinas and privately owned campgrounds, these locations we recognized as being very important to recreational users and are certainly used by people who are traveling along the trail. But just the difficulty and the logistics of trying to coordinate with every single one of these private property owners and gain access to their property to inventory their amenities just wasn't feasible as part of this study. So we kind of relied on the next best thing, using various guidebooks and online sources as sort of secondary information to identify what amenities are located here and the locations of these services. And then we were able to digitize those and put them on the map so that we can consider them in our gap analysis, but we didn't actually assess the condition of these amenities. At the end of our data collection effort, we had collected over 6,500 amenities across the 2 trails. And then the list here just gives you an overview of the types of amenities that we collected. So within this list, I think there is like at least one other layer of detail. So for example, when you're talking about a restroom, we would have also broken that down into a permanent restroom or a temporary restroom. Signage had various different types of signage that we could categorize. Marinas and campsites, we categorize them as publicly or privately owned, things like that. So there is sort of another level of detail that you don't see here. With the scale of the number of amenities we were collecting, of course, the amount of assessment we were doing was at a very high level. We were kind of taking a few moments to consider the amenity, consider its immediate surroundings, collect information like physical characteristics about it, such as its condition, its material type, its capacity. If it was a bike rack, we'd write down how many bikes it could hold. And then also kind of looking at a very high level at some obvious barriers to accessibility and noting those. We also took a photo of every single amenity that we collected. So at the end of the day, it was a very high level assessment, but it has created an extremely rich data set for Erie Canalway and Canal Corporation that didn't exist before. It was the first amenity inventory of the trail that has ever existed. Having collected all of that data, we set out to sort of first look at the condition of the amenities and try to draw some broad findings about that. So in terms of identifying how to classify condition, we relied on a previous study that was done in 2022 for Canal Corporation that inventoried assets along the trail, some of which were related to recreation, but it went far beyond recreational assets. And they used a 3-tiered classification system that you can see on the screen. So good, fair, and poor. And we decided early on that maintaining this classification system would make a lot of sense just so that there would be consistency and sort of an apples to apples comparison between the 2 studies. So that's how we arrived at that decision. On the screen, you see 3 examples of bike repair stations to illustrate the difference between these classifications. So the one on the left is, a brand new commercial grade repair station on a very stable surface, very easy to use and all operational, no signs of wear and tear. The second one has sort of been cobbled together with a couple of some commercial grades, some user grade or retail grade pieces of equipment, but still functioned. And then the last one was rusted out, not operational, pieces are falling off, not connected to a surface that someone might be biking on. So that would have received a poor condition classification. Similarly, these are 3 examples of low docks along the trails. The one on the left is in sort of pristine condition. Everything is in working order. The one on the top right has some signs of wear with the tiles kind of coming apart and this uneven surface where you would access it. And then the one at the bottom had, some significant bowing and warping that made it really difficult to use and was also kind of jutting out pretty high over the water and would not be something that would be recommended to use. And things like that, we'd recommend sort of being replaced or have an overhaul or potentially be removed. At a global scale, we tried to give sort of this 30,000-foot view of the condition rating. So the chart to the top right shows all amenities regardless of which trail they were associated with. We were pleasantly surprised to see that depending on the region, between 65 and 85% of amenities were in good condition based on that classification system. The second bar chart shows all amenities associated only with the Erie Canal, so the water trail. And then the one on the bottom shows only amenities associated with the Erie Canalway Trail, the land trail. Admitting Laura Wilson. We noticed that overall Erie Canal, Canalway Trail amenities, Erie Canal and New York State Canalway Trail amenities were in better condition than Erie Canalway Trail amenities. Sorry, that's a mouthful. Also notice that regions 1 and 2 tended to need more investment along the Erie Canal just based on condition, whereas the opposite was true for regions 1, 3, and 4. A lot of the amenities associated with the water were in great condition, whereas amenities associated with bicycling, walking, running may be in need of more investment. This gives you a snapshot of this region only, how amenities compare to one another, and it kind of gives us some broad conclusions we can draw about where maybe a focus of investment should be. So parking lots and picnic areas, this is actually not unique to Region 4. I think we saw this across all 4 regions, but those consistently showed up as, a large proportion of those amenities being in fair or poor condition, and you can see that sort of at the bottom of your screen here. Benches and bike racks, I think in this region compared to others, were actually in pretty good condition. There were other places where we saw that this was not really the case. I think we've got almost 80% in good condition for both of those. But I will say, I noticed in Region 4 and also in other regions, there are plenty of places where bike racks and benches there's more than I think could be used, even considering the high amount of use that these places get in this region. There may be places where you see redundancy, where there could be a bike rack that's sort of reached the end of its useful life, and there's another one that's brand new sitting right next to it. Just removing the one or decommissioning the one that is in poor condition without having to make any further investment, I think would go a long way toward enhancing the experience and sort of the welcoming nature of the trail. So places where you have redundancy, where we often saw that with benches and bike racks, could be a place for a closer look to see if there's anything that, is not really serving the trail anymore and could be removed. Marinas and hand launches in Region 4 are ones just based on this bar chart that we saw kind of stood out as a higher proportion that are in poor condition. I think there's only about less than 60% in good condition. And then bike racks, campsites, and drinking fountains, I think this is definitely a difference from other regions that we're seeing. Almost all of those amenities in this region are in good condition. So I think that's great to see and really speaks to the amount of investment that's taken place here over the last however many years. I mentioned that we did do a high-level assessment of accessibility. I do like to caveat this pretty heavily just to say that a true accessibility assessment of any amenity or any part of a trail is an engineering study unto itself. It really goes to a much deeper level than a planning study, which is what this was. We were not out there measuring slopes, grades, distances, clearances, or anything like that. Our charge was really to take a very high-level visual assessment of the amenities, identify anything that seemed to be obviously inaccessible, whether it was, a stairway that prevented someone from accessing it in a wheelchair or something not being connected to a firm, stable surface, amenities that were clearly not adaptive, things like that is how we made that classification. We were not doing a sort of engineering level study. So it provides a basis for further analysis and further investigation, but it's really meant to be only that. That said, based on all the photos that we took and amenities that we assessed, we did come up with a series of sort of best practices and considerations for future investment that could take things that are already places where you can see that accessibility is being considered and designed for, but that could be enhanced even further. So the box to the left talks about designing for assistance. We heard pretty loud and clear from many of our stakeholder groups that yes, the point of having adaptive equipment is to make it so that as many people as possible can use them independently. That said, we also heard from users that, some people just require or prefer or feel more comfortable when they can have assistance. And so thinking about hand launches in particular, designing them so that that is possible is a really important consideration. And just two examples here. The one on the left is in Pittsford, where you can see a nice platform on both sides of the rollers so that someone could stand on either side of that roller and assist somebody who's trying to launch as they're going into the water. This one in Palmyra, conversely, does have a very nice large platform, but on the opposite side of the rollers is just water. There's nowhere for someone to stand and help another person get into the water. So that sort of describes the difference between the two. And then also thinking about connections. These are three examples of launches where the one in the top left in Baldwinsville had, a perfectly accessible path from a parking lot to a sidewalk to a transition plate to a gangway, kind of a seamless experience for someone with a mobility impairment. The one on the bottom left was a similar situation, but the gangway was very steep and the transition plate is a little bit off kilter because of the uneven surface and sort of the degradation of that concrete. So that could present a challenge for some users. And then the one on the right in Palmyra does have this concrete pad at the top and has a smooth transition down to the gangway. But beyond that, what you kind of can't see in the picture is that there were, just a rocky path that led to a parking lot and no way for someone to, in a wheelchair or with a mobility impairment, to go from the parking lot to the launch. So those are important considerations as well. Some of the points made on this slide, I think probably to this user group and this audience will come as no surprise. But I think Mona and Sasha both highlighted it at the beginning of the presentation, and I'll reiterate it here, that accessibility is going to be a focus of design for this trail in the future and a focus of investment. That means, of course, complying with ADA standards and all applicable codes, but it can also mean going beyond those minimum standards and making things as inclusive and as accessible as possible. I think that really relies on engaging with stakeholder groups and subject matter experts to understand how that can be enhanced. But that will be a strong consideration going forward. I think it's great that Canal Corporation and Erie Canalway have already started to release guiding documents that can assist in that effort. 2 points we heard from stakeholders that not to say that they were surprising, but they really struck me and stuck with me as we were undertaking this study, was the importance of focusing on creating networks of accessible hubs and nodes along the trail. So rather than just being opportunistic about where we install adaptive equipment, think about places where, maybe there's a location like I'm thinking of Fairport in this region where there's tons of accessible equipment. There's a seamless surface. Everything is flat and smooth, and the adaptive equipment is all there and available to rent. But if you get in the water at Fairport and you don't have anywhere to go that's also accessible, I'm not saying that's the case, just using that as an example, that can limit the recreational experience for users if they don't have, a network of places where they can launch and land along the trail, and kind of gets at the issue of equity for all users. If we can start to build on some of the strengths and the places that we've seen already with a clear investment in accessibility, we can sort of start to build out from those strengths and build a stronger network of hubs and nodes that are accessible. We also heard the importance, it's not written on the slide, but the importance of choosing community partners who are going to be invested in accessibility in the long term. So maybe today they're installing an adaptive launch, but they have a long-term plan for how they're going to build on that in the future and think about paths of travel from the canal to their communities and to their downtowns. People who are going to be committed to replacing or repairing equipment when it breaks, who are going to be committed to hearing their stakeholders, hearing community feedback, and addressing any concerns that people have. All of these things go a long way toward building trust among users, and that we also heard loud and clear was very important to enhancing accessibility along the trail. And then lastly, just providing information so that recognizing that no two people in the world are going to have the same definition of what is accessible to them and what is usable to them. So providing information about what these places look like, what equipment is available, helps people kind of make their own decisions about where they want to access the trail. And then the last point I'll make on accessibility. This is an image from the hand launch facility design guide of an adaptive launch. And I think by any measure, this would be considered the epitome of adaptive equipment for recreational users. With that said, we heard from several paddlers that, either depending on the type of paddlecraft they use or just their level of comfort, they either wouldn't be comfortable or would not be able to use a piece of equipment like this. And so if this is the only thing that exists at a certain location, that basically prevents them from being able to launch or land here. And so what we heard is, yes, we want to see more adaptive equipment along the trail, but it should be co-located with another method of accessing the water, so that people of various abilities, various comfort levels can make their choices about how they want to access the water. Based on all of that analysis and sort of our stakeholder interviews and initial review of the data, we identified a series of best practices. I will say these are not meant to be hard and fast rules. They are merely meant to be guidelines and gave us a framework for how we could evaluate the presence of amenities along the trail. That said, I think they're a really great resource and present a really great ideal that people should be striving for in the future. So I'll go through each of those. The first was identifying the right spacing of amenities along the trail. And I do want to highlight the word ideal. I recognize there's plenty of places along the trail that this doesn't exist now and may not be feasible in the future. But this was really based on speaking to stakeholders and understanding how often they actually use any of these amenities. Some of them are getting used quite frequently, like restrooms or drinking fountains every few hours. Showers, laundry, maybe it's once a day or every few days. So there's a difference in the distance based on how frequently things are being used. And so we kind of backed out from that frequency, how far a user may reasonably be traveling during that time period. And that's how we arrived at these spacing guidelines. We obviously also vetted these with Canal Corporation, with Erie Canalway, just for sort of feasibility and kind of that gut check. So these are amenities that would be used by any user regardless of the mode of travel. And then we also identified sort of similar spacing recommendations based on specific user-oriented amenities. So bike amenities, boater amenities, and paddler amenities. I'll note that among boaters that we spoke to, it sounded like based on their level of self-sufficiency and sort of the equipment that they come with, they did not have many needs and kind of felt that the needs that they had were being met with the current spacing of amenities. And so we'll talk about that for Region 4 when we get to sort of the geographic specific recommendations, but I just want to highlight that here. And that was something that kind of surprised me. We also created a framework of hubs and nodes and set out to define what those words would mean. Again, kind of creating this basis for our analysis and for our recommendations. And so this was kind of one of our charges in the study, was to identify places where there's already a strong concentration of amenities and places where there might be prioritization for future investment. So those are called hubs and nodes. I would say they're very similar in type, but where they differ is in scale. So both hubs and nodes are going to have proximity to some center of activity where people can access off-trail services. They will have strong connections, ideally to both the Erie Canal and Canalway Trail, except where the trail diverges, where the two trails diverge. And then there will be some concentration of amenities. When it comes to hubs, we would be talking about a larger concentration and a larger variety of amenities, things that could be used by both experienced users and beginners. Whereas at nodes, we might be considering a lesser concentration, maybe some of the more basic amenities, just those critical amenities that people need, that are more geared towards people who might be going out just for an afternoon as opposed to a long distance trip. For hubs and nodes, we also identified which amenities would ideally be located at each of those. Again, this is a guideline. I don't think anybody expects that achieving this amount of consistency across the trail system is really feasible, but it does give sort of that guiding light to consider as you're thinking about investments. So you'll see again, a larger number of amenities are considered high priority at hubs, lesser at nodes. And so the dark blue represents high priority and the light blue represents a lower priority. Just to give an example, looking at restrooms right here, I think one of our ideals is that there would be a permanent restroom located at every hub. So that would have a high priority. At a node, that would be great to have, certainly wouldn't discourage that, but I don't think it would be as critical. And so that's shown as a lower priority. We heard from several users that especially at nodes or at smaller sort of trail access points, a temporary restroom like a porta potty, as long as it's clean and well maintained, is absolutely fine and they're happy to use that. So that would be a higher priority for all nodes. And so all of these graphics are in the report if you want to take a closer look, but I'm just kind of pointing out the highlights and trying to explain some of our sort of considerations and methodology. Having identified sort of those guidelines and best practices, we embarked on sort of the culminating part of this study, which was to identify needs and opportunities for improvement. So I'm going to start with the amenities that are specific to this region from the Tonawandas to Fairport. But I'll note that in each region, these are the things that we were making recommendations on. So choosing places that hubs and nodes made sense, identifying gaps in amenities where we see long distances and where people can't access the things that they need. And then for those gaps, where do we find candidate locations, whether they're at hubs or nodes or anywhere along the trail that could start to fill those gaps. Once again, don't want to beat a dead horse, but this is meant to be guidance, not a decree or not gospel. Certainly, I think we all recognize that any type of investment at any location along the trail would be welcome and would enhance the experience for all users. I also think all of you who are on the ground every day know your communities best, know what people are asking for. And so, if you see something that you don't immediately agree with, I think that's okay. And it doesn't preclude any other type of investment. So this is the map of Region 4 showing the hubs and nodes that were identified as part of this study. The hubs are located at Gateway Harbor in Tonawanda, at Lockport, at Brockport, and at Fairport, all of our ports. So these were places where we saw a really strong concentration of amenities, a really strong connection to downtowns, and sort of appealing to a wide number of users, whether they're coming for an afternoon or coming for a longer period of time. And then the nodes, I won't read out all of them, but you can see them throughout this map, are sort of smaller downtowns. Sometimes they're community parks, places where we still saw some concentration of amenities that people might be stopping and resting or accessing services. And then this map gives a lot of information all in one place, but I think it's a great snapshot of showing exactly what amenities exist at each of these hubs and nodes, and most importantly, what does not exist right now based on our inventory. So anywhere that you see a brightly colored circle or icon, that means that it exists right now. If it's grayed out, that means it does not exist. And if it has a red circle, I'm just looking for one. If it has a red circle around it, that means that it was assessed to be in poor condition. And so this is only at hubs and nodes. The rest of the series of maps gives a sense of what else we saw along the trail. So it's not to say that every one of these icons is expected to be lit up in the coming years, but it just gives a sense of like where we are today and how we can track progress over time. So the rest of this series of maps shows all amenities we collected, whether or not they were located at hubs and nodes, and breaks them down by various user types. So this first map talks about shared amenities, which is really focused on restrooms and drinking fountains that were associated with the water trail. So the Erie Canal, New York State Canalway Trail. overall in this region, and I probably should have said this up front, is really fantastic in terms of the amount, variety, condition, frequency of amenities. I think it's clearly been a focus of investment over the years. That said, there are a few places where we see some gaps, like between Amherst and Holly, we have about 55 miles or 56 miles where there's no drinking fountain. We certainly recognize, especially in more remote rural areas, that installing a drinking fountain is no small feat. You have to have the right infrastructure in place. You have access to drinking water. That said, we kind of, at a very high level, just identified places where we see permanent restrooms that have plumbing, where perhaps there could be potential to install a drinking fountain if the infrastructure is already there and coming to that place. So there's 2 locations here identified at Wide Waters Marina and in Middleport, where that could be a potential. Not to say those are the only places. I think they'd be welcome anywhere. But that was really the only gap in amenities for these types that we saw along this stretch, which is fantastic. And I'll just also highlight the dark blue restrooms are permanent. The light blue are porta potties or self-composting toilets. This is a map of paddler amenities. So here we're talking about launches, boat rentals or paddlecraft rentals, just those 2 things. And we've kind of broken them down. So the dark blue launches are adaptive launches. The light blue are low docks with rollers. And then the gray is just anything else that would be considered a launch. And that does include concrete ramps, which are used by paddlers. So again, a very great network of launches, especially in the eastern portion between Brockport and Fairport. We see great sort of pairing of adaptive launches with paddlecraft rentals. So like here in Brockport is a great example. I know Fairport has one as well. So seeing things like that, we heard from stakeholders, those 2 things, paddlecraft rentals and adaptive launches, pair really nicely together because both are going to be appealing to people who are maybe trying out paddling for the first time, aren't experienced, certainly don't have their own equipment, and may also not feel super comfortable accessing the water. And so we kind of are making the recommendation that it would be great that if at every hub you had both an adaptive launch and a paddlecraft rental. If you were going to invest in that type of equipment, those would be great starting places to provide that. And I think in most of the places here, we do have that. I think even at Wide Waters Marina and in Tonawanda, they might not be considered adaptive, but they are at least low docks with rollers that make it easier for people to access the water. Between Lockport and Holly, there are several launches. It would be nice to see some additional investment of adaptive launches again to sort of build out from these hubs and start to create those networks of accessible locations. And then I also just want to highlight when it comes to Lockport, right in the downtown is clearly a center of activity. A lot of the paddling amenities are located a few miles down the road at Wide Waters Marina. We weren't being so specific as to draw boundaries around a hub or a node. These are circles on a map that are meant to represent general locations. But I do think that warrants further investigation, and I'm sure that this community has been considering ways to improve it, and I'm sure there are barriers involved. But we kind of documented places where we see opportunities that we could be bringing more users together and create a stronger nexus of activity. I alluded to this earlier, but overall, we thought that boater amenities, based on what we heard from stakeholders and how frequently they need them, are really well positioned, not only in this region, but throughout the trail system. And I think that really is clear based on this map. I mean, we see a dearth of marinas located here. I think it was between 50 and 100 miles between pump outs, and we're certainly covered there. I think between Tonawanda and Pittsford are the only 2. So it's a pretty long stretch, I guess, in this region. There could be an opportunity to add one, but I think from what we heard, this is not a sort of a hardship for anyone. And then these are the shared amenities that are located or associated with the land trail. So people who are biking, walking, running along the towpath. We see a similar gap between amenities between Amherst and Albion, about a 50-mile distance between restrooms. This is not to say, I mean, if I go back up a few maps, you saw a lot of restrooms here associated with the water trail. It doesn't mean that they're not accessible or, can be accessed by people on the towpath, but there might be a lack of signage or, something that's making it not obvious that those exist. And so if there was better wayfinding or better connections between the two trails, that would mean that those restrooms that are not shown on this map could be more appealing or more widely used by people on the towpath. Otherwise, I think amenities here are pretty well spaced. And then diving deeper into amenities that are specific to bicyclists, similar to the paddling experience, we're making the recommendation that in an ideal world, all hubs would have both, all three things: a bike parking, a bike rental, and a bike repair station. And so this map kind of highlights places where that is not the case and where there might be opportunities to add one of those three things. Of course, bike rentals are sort of a challenging one. They're going to mostly be provided by private vendors or local bike shops. But I think it's still important to highlight where those opportunities exist. Overall, though, I think we're seeing a really good network here of bike parking at most of the nodes, bike repair stations at most of the nodes as well. So it's definitely a strong foundation to build from. And then sort of taking a broader view and thinking about opportunities to improve the entire trail system, not just in this region or not just at a specific location. This is again partly based on stakeholder interviews, but also based on our observations in the field. Recognizing that people, the state, various entities, various communities have limited funding for capital investment. How can we maximize the utility of the amenities that are already there? So we have a really strong system of locks and marinas that are geared towards boaters, but those places tend to feel pretty out of scale for paddlers. Are there ways that we can make those places feel more welcoming to paddlers? That might mean just enhancing the signage that might be visible from someone who's sitting 2 feet above the water, clearly marking portage trails for people who are not comfortable locking through at a lock alongside a much larger watercraft. Those are ways to just make people feel more welcome, regardless of the type of vessel that they're using on the water. Similarly, we noticed that a lot of amenities that are geared towards long distance users who might be spending multiple days on the trail, such as showers and laundry facilities, were again geared towards boaters. They might be located at a marina. They might be obvious if you're kind of getting off at a higher dock. But I think enhanced signage to make it very clear that those are also available to bicyclists, to paddlers, and kind of directing people from the towpath to those locations could maximize their utility as well. Locks are obviously an important resource for camping because most of them allow folks to camp out there overnight. They are very primitive sites. I don't think we would recommend, especially in some of the remote locations that we're installing permanent restrooms or shower facilities or anything like that. But just something simple to make it clear that yes, you're allowed to camp here. Yes, this is where you should go. Here's a phone number if you need more information. That sort of sense of arrival with signage, benches, a garbage can, a porta potty, all located in the same place kind of gives people that aha moment and that feeling of confidence when they're arriving after a long day that, yes, this is a place I can stay and I can feel comfortable being here overnight. And then lastly, we just heard that, when you're talking about places where the trail is connected to a community, how can we enhance that sense of arrival when you're coming off the trail? So maybe it's sort of a gateway element. I think in this region, compared to others, that's not as much of an issue. I think in this region, both trails are sort of intimately embedded into the fabric of the communities and into sort of the fabric of the downtowns. But that was something that we heard from stakeholders along the way. Wayfinding, again, was a very important topic among many of our stakeholders and something that we noticed as an opportunity for improvement. Very happy to hear that Canal Corporation is already considering and taking a concerted effort to improve along the trail. But these are 3 examples of sort of where folks said that there should be a focus of investment. So on-road trail markers, there are places along the system. I don't believe in this region very much, but if you sort of further east, it's more common that part of the Erie Canalway Trail is along the road or along state highways. We are certainly limited in what we can do to increase that signage or make it larger because all of that is governed by MUTCD requirements. But I still wanted to document it as a concern that people found for wayfinding that made it difficult, especially at turning points and decision points, to know where to go and where to feel confident on the trail. Mile markers were located in some places, not in others. If you look at sort of a map of where those are located, you'll see large concentrations in certain areas where probably a couple of communities have made a concerted effort to install them, but they're not consistent along the trail. And I think that would help a lot with that idea of navigating without ever having to pull out your phone, is to have sort of that tracker along the way. And so if there was I recognize that's with all the communities that are involved in trail maintenance and trail ownership, that's no small feat, but it was something that people said would be really useful. And then lastly, water trail markers, which are designed to give people who are on the water sort of a signal that this is a place that you can land. But they are also just a great marker that shows this is a place where you can access the water. And so places, especially in more remote locations where it's not obvious that there's a launch located there, maybe adding a second one of these signs that's closer to the water or some sort of signifier that this is a canal access point would be helpful, because a lot of these are not, they might be visible for the water, but not necessarily visible from the road. And then destination signs. So I think Sasha alluded to this earlier, but across the state, we saw a wide variety of signs that are pointing people to destinations along the trail and saying, you know, this is how far to go to get to the next place. Different colors, different amounts of information, different types of information. Some are in great condition, others have been vandalized or are covered up by overgrowth. What we heard is that not necessarily the exact design, but the sign located to the bottom left has sort of the right amount of information, is very clear, and gives people sort of, again, confidence that this is the way to bike to Lockport, this is the way to bike to Rochester, and this is how far it'll take you, and it really helps with trip planning. When you're arriving at a destination, like coming to a place where a trail enters a downtown, folks again said that having simple amount of information that points you to general locations where you can reasonably expect to get services such as a restroom, a restaurant, a place to stay overnight, such as the two signs on the left-hand side, would be good examples of that, and something that people should strive for. Maps, I think, people saw less utility in that. They still might be used in places where there are sort of larger hubs where people are staying for a long time and might be doing a lot of exploring. So I certainly think there is use for that, and kind of use for both types of destination signs. But these are just two examples of that as well. So at the end of our study, we do provide a series of next steps that kind of give sort of a way to sort of build momentum based on the findings of this study. When we initially wrote them, they were geared towards Erie Canalway and Canal Corporation, but I certainly think they're broadly applicable to any community or any entity who's involved in enhancing the trail experience. So I'll just run through these. So establishing an implementation plan for your location, you know, if you know what you have now, you know what you'd like to have in the future, what's your plan for creating that? Which ones are the priorities? Which are going to come first? And then identifying cost estimates that are associated with those improvements, and funding opportunities that can help you fill the gap. So Sasha's going to speak in a moment about some of those opportunities that are upcoming. Also engaging with community partners. We did do a ton of engagement through this study, but it was sort of a single point in time. And you know, we don't have the level of granularity to be able to talk to individual users who are on the trail every day. People in these local communities and people like you who are on the call today do have that ability. And so I think it's important to engage with them to get a deeper understanding of exactly what would be most useful in your specific location. Doing an accessibility assessment of individual locations along the trail, I think would be great. As I mentioned, this took a very high level view, but I think if you're a community partner who wants to enhance accessibility of the trail, that means taking a broader look at the entire community, streets, sidewalks, places where people might be coming from an origin to a destination at the trail, and looking at that sort of holistic experience from start to finish. Incorporating signage and amenity standards. So Canal Corporation has their new guidelines that they've released. And I think as those signs, especially the markers, which are going to be, you know, over time replaced, if you're looking to replace them or repair ones that are broken or in poor condition, there could be an opportunity to start using those. And then exploring opportunities for private partnership. We see plenty of boat rentals and bike rentals that are already in place in this region, which is fantastic. But that is, I think, we recognize that private vendors are probably the most likely way of making those types of rentals most available to people. This study and this report gives a great overview of where those exist now and where there might be gaps. And so we hope that private vendors will sort of see those opportunities and capitalize on them. And that is all I have. We'll pass it over to Sasha to talk about upcoming funding opportunities, and then we can do a Q&A if anyone has some more detailed questions.
Great. Well, thank you, Leanne, so much. So the gap analysis lays out what types of amenities could potentially be useful for different user types on the waterway and on the land trail. And we recognize that funding isn't always easy to come by on a municipality or even county level. But the good news is that the state and federal government, as well as not-for-profits, do offer grant programs to help support efforts like this. So I want to talk about a few. The first one I want to mention, or the first two I'll mention, come through funding through the New York State Canal Corporation. The first is a partnership grant program that we work with Erie Canal National Heritage Corridor on, and that is our New York State Canal System Tourism Infrastructure and Events Grant. So those are broken down into two different pockets. One is tourism infrastructure, and separately is the events grants. This is a smaller grant program, but it has big impacts. The objectives of this is to support infrastructure and events that bring in tourism and help encourage recreation on the canal system. And the eligibility is for local governments, not-for-profits, and recognized Native American tribes. It's worth noting that this year's round, we're putting additional emphasis on accessibility and addressing services and amenities identified in the gap analysis. So certainly, we're definitely looking for this grant to help meet the needs of the gap analysis. We see this as being a really great tool for getting amenities out on the waterway and trail. This grant program is unique because it doesn't require a capital project. So as an example, we could fund rental of equipment that helps facilitate recreation. So if you want to partner with a third-party vendor that does kayak rentals or bike rentals, we could help support that through this grant program. If you want to rent porta-johns or portable drinking fountains, this grant program could help facilitate that. We do require a 50% match, but also unique to this grant program is that in-kind services like staff time, volunteer time can count towards the match. Just a quick note about the timeframe of the grant program. It's coming up very soon. October 14th will be the open application period, and it will end on November 27th, and we will award in February of 2026. We are actually doing 2 workshops that are coming up very quickly. These workshops for the grant programs will focus on accessibility. So one will be about how to make an accessible project, and that's going to be on September 18th. And then we're doing one about how to create an accessible event, and that will be on September 14th. Sorry, no, I went a little opposite order, but I'll put the information for these workshops in the meeting chat. And if you have any questions after this meeting, you can always email me directly. Let's go to the next slide. The other grant program that Canal Corporation offers is our larger of the 2 grant programs, and that's our Canalway grant program. It's offered through the consolidated funding application process that New York State offers. This goes on a cyclical basis. It opens in May and closes in January with an announcement sometime in the new year. So we are actively reviewing applications right now. But we have $1 million annually to distribute across applicants. These are for capital projects that encourage tourism, recreation, and also align with Regional Economic Development Council plans. We look for project readiness in the applications, but we also see this being a great opportunity. I saw that there are many areas that were identified as hubs that still were kind of missing amenities. This would be a great program to apply for a larger scale project, maybe like a pocket park or even a municipal park that exists on the system today for some improvements. We've seen visitor centers get built through these grant programs. We've seen accessible boat launches get built through these programs. So this is a really great funding opportunity, larger dollar amount. The minimum and maximum are up on the screen. And the eligibility requirements are the same as the program that I mentioned before. So not-for-profits, local governments, and recognize Native American tribes, and see if I'm missing anything. So just regarding the scale of these projects, if you're thinking about doing something, you do have time. You'll have until spring of next year to kind of formulate an application. And certainly if you have any questions, once again, feel free to reach out to me and I'll get you in touch with the program administrator. And then lastly, there are other state funding opportunities. So part of the consolidated funding application that New York State offers, there are several other agencies that there are many other agencies that are participate in that. But the great thing about the consolidated funding application process is that it is one application in which you can apply for a series of grants. And these are a few that we think could be good matches for potentially meeting the demands or the recommendations. Recommendations, not demands, but the recommendations of the gap analysis. The demands are really from the users. And so one is the Environmental Protection Fund grant program for parks, preservation, and heritage sites. This is good if you have an existing park facility and it's administered through state parks. It's also for capital projects, so you won't be able to, expense rentals or anything like that. The Municipal Parks and Recreation Grant Program, that's also administered through state parks, another really great opportunity for building municipal parks and recreational sites. Also a requirement, it's a capital project. The Recreational Trails Program, that's administered through parks, but it is a federal grant program. I believe it's on a 2-year basis. It's very competitive and it typically is aligned with land trails, not as much water trails, but I'm sure you could make a compelling point if you are applying something that is both used by pedestrians and waterway users. And then lastly, the local waterfront revitalization program is offered through the Department of State. This is a larger scale capital improvement grant program. We often see local waterfront revitalization program being matched with our Canalway grant program. These programs pair very nicely with one another. And so just want to encourage you to take a look at those if you're not already familiar with them. And then there's also federal non-for-profits, local non-for-profits. There's many opportunities to find local, national support mechanisms. And so the list below are just some ideas. So Rails to Trails Conservancy, they offer grant programs. I would check out their website and just see what they have to offer. Since you are based in Western New York, the Ralph C. Wilson Foundation has been a donor for many really great capital improvement projects, park projects in the Western region. So certainly look them up and see what they've done and see if there's any projects that kind of align with their initiatives. And then Mona, I know you had added these last two, so I'll let you speak to those.
Sure, yeah. So there are also private grants that are available. One example is athletic brewing companies, 2 for the trail grants. As Sasha mentioned earlier, there are like good pairings. This one is intended for trail maintenance, waterway protection, urban green space improvements, invasive species removal, beach cleanup, so that type of thing. So once perhaps you've added an amenity or made some capital improvements, that might be another, funding source to look into. And then there's the Boating Infrastructure Grant Program. It's through Boat US, and it pays for docks and amenities for visiting boaters so that they can safely dock overnight. The boaters and manufacturers fund the program through excise taxes and duties, so it's not through the taxpayer funding. So in the chat, I will add the website where you can find more information. It's administered by state parks as well. So again, these are just a few examples. You can, put in a Google search, and there are many other federal, nonprofit, and private foundations that offer funding for trails.
Mona, can I just add something on the boating grant program? I just want to highlight that, in case there's anyone in the room who is, specifically interested in boating or boating amenities. I know that our study kind of shows that in terms of spacing of marinas, spacing of boat parking opportunities, there wasn't really a need to add more. But I think that we weren't going into the level of granularity where we're looking at, capacity or utilization of any individual location. So I think if you and your community know, yes, we have a marina here, but it's consistently strained in terms of capacity, and we could add more capacity, I think this would be, that would certainly be welcome. And I think that grant could be a good way to do so.
Yep. Yeah, great point. I'm just adding to the chat here the website for that Boat US grant. Yeah. So, yep, great. So thank you, everybody, for listening in. Wanted to open it up to questions. And while the screen is up, please note our email addresses for Sasha and I. If you have any questions that you don't want to ask right now, or you think of something later, please feel free to email either one of us. So we can, answer any questions, or if anybody has any comments. Feel free to raise your hand if you'd like. Okay, I think we did a really good job then, if nobody has any questions. Well, of course, take some time to digest everything that you heard. If you think of any questions that, come up later. Oh, Peter's got a question.
No, I think he just thumbs up.
Okay.
I just want to note, we put the website for the report in the chat. You can also Google it, and it will hopefully be the first thing that pops up. On the website, we also have it broken down regionally by the recommendations. So to make it as digestible as possible, we went through, Leanne did a great job going through the methodology. So you may want to skip ahead in the report, which given the fact that it's broken down, you're able to do that. And also I just put in the accessibility grant workshops that are coming up in the next 2 weeks. So hopefully you check those out. That's it. Thank you.
Great. All right. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the afternoon.
Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Bye. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, Nicole.